Welcome to the Wild Ag Podcast, where we'll serve as a connection point for landowners and conservation professionals who want to integrate conservation and agriculture. I'm Dr. Andrew Little, Professor of Landscape Ecology and Habitat Management and Extension Specialist at the University of Nebraska.
And I'm Nate Pfluger, Precision Ag Coordinator for Pheasants Forever and an avid outdoorsman with friends and family in my free time. Together, we'll work to bring you perspectives from both landowners and conservation professionals for discussions on soil, water, and wildlife in ag-dominated landscapes.
All right, welcome back to the Wild Ag Podcast. My name is Andy Little. I'm here with my co-host, Nathan Pfluger, and today we have a great episode for you guys on virtual fencing and livestock, particularly cattle. Today we have a couple great individuals here attending this podcast. One is Kaitlyn Dozler, and we'll have her introduce herself here in a second. She was a graduate student on this research she's going to talk about today. And Mitch Stephenson, Dr. Mitch Stephenson, who is based out at Panhandle Research and Extension Center with the University of Nebraska. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kaitlyn and let her introduce herself, and then we'll get started.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Thanks, Nathan. I guess just a little bit about me. I grew up farming and ranching in central Nebraska. I got my undergrad here from UNL in fisheries and wildlife, which is how I was first introduced to you and how I was introduced to Mitch through the grassland department here at UNL. And yeah, Mitch approached me about this opportunity with virtual fencing. And like a lot of people, I didn't know what it was. And so it's been a fun 2 years kind of deep diving into the project and learning the new technology. And yeah, I'm excited to talk about it.
Awesome. All right, Dr. Mitch Stephenson, you want to give a little introduction for yourself and what you do out there in the Panhandle?
Yeah, Mitch Stephenson. I'm the range management specialist here, and so this is off-campus center that a lot of folks don't quite know about, but we have 3 research extension education centers here in Nebraska, and the one in Scottsbluff's about 6 hours west of Lincoln, and so my background is primarily in rangeland and grazing management. And so oftentimes one of the big things that we're really exploring is how to get cattle to graze a certain way or how to manipulate how they're grazing, either through timing or intensity or their spatial distribution across the landscape. And oftentimes we're looking at ways to improve production or better manage the rangeland that's there, but also really interested in targeted applications that we can put grazing out for specific objectives that might be outside of production as well. And so that kind of started our interest. Been doing research in using GPS collars to better understand how cattle make grazing decisions. And so it just seemed like a natural fit. And once an opportunity came for us to get some funding to get a virtual fence system, it was really interesting and neat to jump into that data and research direction, I guess I should say.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I think one of the great things, and Mitch, both you and I have this with our appointments, is extension. And so being able to take and translate this research out to our producers, landowners across the state, which is such a key thing. And so, yeah, a lot of the great work that you're doing out there and working with ranchers across the state, really benefiting them in their operation, finding ways they can optimize their overall systems. So, yeah, that's great. Nathan, I don't know if you want to jump in with anything.
No, I mean, kind of like Kaitlyn mentioned, this virtual fencing is really new to me. So is this something that was developed at UNL, or did you guys hear that producers were wanting to learn more about it? Or I guess, how did the research project come about?
Yeah, so no, it was not developed here at UNL. So the virtual fence, a lot of the early research here in the United States anyways was conducted in the early 2000s. Most of it was at the Jornada Range in New Mexico, where a lot of the early prototypes, I guess you would say, that were tested down there. They were pretty interesting when you see pictures of them. They were like solar panels and took up a big chunk of the back of that cow's like a harness on the back of their neck. And, I think one of the papers, I really like the quote. It was Dean Anderson, and he said that although he said something to the effect of, although cumbersome, they're surprising or highly effective. They said they worked really pretty well, but they're pretty cumbersome. And so the technology was these huge units that had solar panels on the back of the necks. And so, but it took, a number of years to get that to where the technology was that they could be packaged in a small enough way that they could put on animals, and then also the costs were down that they could be offered at a commercial scale. And so that happened, it was probably 4 or 5 years ago when that really started ramping up, where some companies were jumping in on that. We purchased a system in 2022 and got that set up. We got some funding through the USDA ARS to explore this more as this technology was really coming on. And so what our role was more to do is look at it more in an applied way. Okay, we get this new technology, it's now available to producers. How can we better understand, maybe some of the challenges that are associated with it, some of the benefits, and how to better utilize it in a management system that makes sense, both from an ecological standpoint, from a reduction standpoint, and an economic standpoint.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I'm just curious, kind of thinking about this technology as a whole. Precision ag is obviously growing as a whole, and precision livestock management, I would argue, is similarly growing. So kind of thinking about how this technology is changing the way we manage our systems. Can you guys talk a little bit about, collectively, like how this technology is changing the game, per se, for producers, and thinking about maybe innovative ways that they're able to utilize it? And, I kind of think you mentioned earlier, Mitch, about GPS technology, even just that, independent of some of the virtual fencing, kind of technology we're going to talk about today, just how producers are able to utilize that new technology.
One of the most, I guess, interesting things for me on the front of virtual fencing is the fact that, you set up all your boundaries from your computer. So I'm sitting here in Lincoln and I can set those boundaries for my cows on my laptop, and it's going to get sent to those callers out at the ranch that are 5 hours away.
Oh, sure.
So I can change those fence boundaries from here in Lincoln. I can go on and see where those cattle are anywhere from 2 hours all the way up to 5 minutes, depending on what you have that GPS set at.
Sure.
So you don't have to be physically there with your cows 24/7 to be able to see what's going on.
Sure.
And while, of course, you always want to be there with your cows, you want to check your cows, obviously,
yeah.
but like in places way out west, they talk about like it reduces a lot of time if your cows are out there on thousands of acres, and it might take 5 days for your cowboys to go out there and figure out actually where those cows are, round up almost every individual and bring them back. Where if you could look on your laptop and be like, okay, they're here, you can send them out to that spot right away.
Sure.
And you're reducing a lot of that time. On the wildlife side of things, you talk about the physical fence conflict with a lot of wildlife. And then you start going up like to the northwest, a lot of the Forest Service land, they talked about it with elk.
Oh,
being
sure.
able to eliminate a lot of those cross fences and electric fences, and eliminating a lot of those problems with elk running through those fences and causing problems for ranchers and stuff like that. And
Absolutely.
so I think it can save ranchers a variety, cost of labor, physical fencing, time, all that kind of stuff. Those are probably the big things that I've really taken away from the technology.
No, that's awesome. Thanks, Kaitlyn.
Yeah, it's interesting because when we think about like in our cropland, there's a lot of these tools that are really just kind of standard. When you think about high accuracy GPS and getting a lot of data every pass that you take that tractor across there, those are pretty exciting, and I think have been around maybe a little bit longer. But it's harder to get that technology on a live animal and at a small enough package that you can still get all that data.
Oh, sure.
But and it's strong enough, right? Too, because it's a live animal can sometimes be hard on equipment, and so it's really kind of been, I think there's a number of different options, and there's a lot of companies jumping into this space right now that are developing tools that can be used. And so everything from the small like ear tags that you can just put in an ear, just like an ear tag, that have little solar panels that can be able to tell you that animal's location. And so if you're just wanting to know, where my cattle grazing, where are they at, that technology is there and getting more and more cost effective. They also have others that have accelerometers. So you think of like your watch, like a Fitbit or an iWatch. As you walk and your arm swings, it's counting those numbers, those movements. Some of the technology could have some of that data as well, and then that can start to tell you things about that animal. And so as that tag moves, they can develop algorithms that associate that with grazing. There's other research that has looked at associating that with illness in an animal. Basically, or part of it could be too, if they're not grazing, then that's likely going to send a signal that says, hey, they're not grazing as much as they usually do, so there might be something wrong with this animal. They're trying to tie it to things like calving, to heat detection for breeding purposes. And so there's just a number of different applications for this that there's been, I think, a lot of research and development here over the last few years that has explored more and more opportunities for this precision livestock management to answer some questions. And, it's similar with the virtual fencing, where when we started, there was, in the United States anyways, there was one company, but now there's 3 or 4 companies out there that have just started here in the United States. And so there's a lot more options in terms of what this looks like too. And so a lot of folks jumping in this space. It really is really exploring some of these tools to see if they can get the questions you need as a manager that are going to be the most helpful, because there's always oh dang, that's really cool, I'd love to see where my cattle graze, or I'd love to know this about that animal. But then also weighing in on, well, that's going to cost X amount of dollars, is that going to translate into X amount of return on that investment?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that are still, I think, important as people look to make these decisions as far as what technology is going to be the most effective for them for their specific purposes. But really, yeah, I mean, I think it's a pretty exciting time to see all this technology come in. And it's also, we as we've gone out and I think shared this with people and talked to them about it, because we're trying to say, hey, this is out here. It may benefit your operation. It may help you manage for either wildlife habitat or other things that you can learn. But it's the cattle industry and grazing animals is an old profession, right? And it takes a lot of stockmanship and a lot of being with your cattle and kind of developing that relationship in a sense with your animals. And so it's and the land too. You want to be out there on the land, right? And so I think it's same with farming and wildlife and all these other things as well. As technology can help you answer specific questions, but it doesn't take the place of really good management or understanding the basic principles of what you're trying to do in terms of raising livestock and managing our rangeland. And so it's really interesting as you talk to folks and kind of parse that out, like how can this help you, but how can it also be a crutch that maybe you lean on too much. And maybe Kaitlyn will tell you some of these stories, but we've seen collars come back completely destroyed. We've seen collars lying on the ground. And they're not telling you much if a tag or a collar is lying on the ground. That's not helping you much for what you spend. That's true. On it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So.
Does it seem like the cattle industry, the ranchers, do you see all age groups wanting to integrate technology, or is it mainly younger generations, or are the older generations interested in it as well?
I think in my experience with it, they're all interested to a certain degree, and that's like they're all interested. They want to learn about it. But then once, you start diving really deeper into it, I've noticed it a lot more with those younger generations that want to make like their individual impact on their operation. Like you want to come home with something to offer to help that operation grow. And that's where I think I see a lot of the interest in that stance coming in, because they want to find ways, to make their own imprint on things. The older generations, I've definitely watched them, like, they get excited about it. They're really interested about it. And there's some of them that absolutely love it. And they tell me they'd put it on their stuff tomorrow. And there's some that, they look at me and they're like, not a chance. And I'm like, that's okay. That's okay. Yep. And that's just, that's the way it's going to be with all the technology side of it. Something we always really tell people is you have to understand your operation. Like what Mitch said, be there, be on the ground. Your cows, the size of your operation, the goals of your operation. And that's a really big thing when it comes into implementing technology, because you don't need all of the new technology to be successful.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, because I view virtual fencing technology as a tool. It's a tool in the toolbox, and it may not fit every single operation. But again, to your point, and I really like that, Mitch, what you mentioned earlier, just that connection to the land and your operation as a whole, and kind of what works best for you. Because again, maybe it doesn't work, best for you. But again, I also think it's interesting because to Nathan, to your earlier point, there's always, like, you think about any technology, there's a various stages of adoption. So you have some individuals that are going to be in that early stage of adoption, some that are kind of later, and then obviously you're going to have some people that say, well, I'm never really going to adopt that.
Yep.
But ultimately, to your point, I think it also comes back to is having some individuals, maybe even within your area, adopting this technology and then teaching their neighbors. Mitch and I, in our role with Extension, we get to help share this research out, but then a lot of it comes down to those kind of personal relationships. And then others can kind of say, well, hey, this worked for me, or this didn't work, or here's how I've kind of learned from this. And I see that a lot, especially in the realm of conservation. So
yeah, the rancher to rancher relationship, I think, is really huge.
Absolutely.
Especially when it comes to implementing stuff like this. And there's a learning curve.
Oh, yeah.
There's a learning curve for us, like Mitch said, stuff falling off and
that's true.
Coming back destroyed. And yeah, the learning curve is definitely there. But you feel great once you learn the technology and it starts to work.
Yeah. Yep. Good. Nathan.
So would you say there are current limitations outside of cost and just kind of the size of the units, or is that mainly still the barrier to entry at this point for ranchers?
Yeah. So they got the size down, and I think cost is probably still one that's there in terms of that. But battery life. Some of the companies use batteries, and so they have a finite time. Several months usually you can get out of them, but if they interact more with that virtual fence, the likelihood that battery is going to go dead sooner is there. A couple of the other companies have implemented using solar panels. So that kind of takes that limitation out to an extent. And so yeah, I mean, they're keeping the time, and we've had relatively good success, I would think. And so there was a learning curve, as Kaitlyn pointed out. And so when we started in 2022, we started putting the collars on. And I guess this was before Kaitlyn had even started. We'd started putting them on some animals and just started looking. And that first summer, we put them out, and Kaitlyn really got things going and learned how the system worked. And the system we had at the time we still have that system, but it uses LoRaWAN technology. So you had to have a tower up on a hill that had a base station that had a solar panel that managed it. Then that hooked up with our cell service, and then that's what spoke to the callers. And so there was a little bit of learning, making sure that we understood the program, making sure we understood the how well it connected. Because in the sandhills, where there's a lot of topography, if they dropped over a hill right below the tower, it didn't bend over that hill quite well enough. And so we spent the first year, I think, really just learning, right, Kaitlyn, and trying to see how well cattle responded to it. We did some work looking at track that. Well, the neat thing about these too is that all these companies have the ability to track cattle as they move. So you're able to look in real time. Okay, where are my cattle grazing in this pasture? And so the first thing we did was we started tracking them, and we noticed that, hey, they're grazing some of this pasture more than others, and just by nature, that's the way cattle are. Areas close to water. This was a sub-irrigated meadow, and so early in the year, they didn't like to get down in the lower parts because it was still a little bit wet. But as that dried out, the vegetation got a little bit more mature than the higher up, I guess, and they're not much higher up, but they hit these upper benches really hard all summer long. And so the first thing we started to do is, once we kind of got those cattle trained to the use of virtual fence, is we just simply started fencing out some of those areas that we thought were getting grazed too heavily. And so there was still a lot of forage out there, a lot of feed, but we wanted to pull them out of these areas that were getting grazed heavy and graze a little bit more on the areas that they didn't hit quite as much. And so we just simply put a couple fences out there, virtual fences, and it was very effective, and that was our first kind of jump into the system of being able to pull cattle into areas where they weren't grazing quite as much. And so it creates a very adaptive platform. Now, in some systems, you could run out like electric fence, polywire, and do that very inexpensively, pretty easy. Other systems that might be a little bit harder to do, manage quite as quickly. As Kaitlyn said, we were able to just put those fences up, and within, a couple hours, all that had been downloaded onto the collars, and those cattle were already getting signals that they to go not go where we had fenced them out.
And when you're saying put up fence, that was on your software, I'm assuming, on your computer.
Yep.
And then that gets downloaded to the collar. And then if they go in that area, does it vibrate? Does it shock? Is it audible? How do they know that they shouldn't be in that area?
So the virtual fence is created using like a GPS positioning system. And so the easiest way I describe it is you think of a shock collar for a dog, except on a cow. So basically, yes, it works exactly how you just said. You have that audio cue zone, and then you have, if they keep going, you have that electrical cue zone. So with some of the technology, you can set those areas, like the width of those areas specifically like for what you want. Some of them come preset. But a lot of times what'll happen is, so the cow will start approaching the virtually fenced off area. And once she hits that audio zone, she gets that high pitched stimulus. And that's supposed to be her first signal to don't go forward, like turn around, go back. And then if she continues to move forward, that's when she hits that electrical cue. And in most systems, they can get shocked up to 3 times for animal like welfare, safety, things like that. And then the system will cut out. And then once the cow goes back into the virtual fenced area, then that system will turn back on. But we saw on average, I mean, our cows, they say 3 days, but some of our cows, I think, were learning the system by the end of like our 30-minute trial periods.
Oh, wow.
I think is what a lot of it was. They learned where those sound boundaries were and those shock boundaries were, and they'd end up in the middle of the pen by the end of it because they were learning where to avoid and stuff like that. And we saw really great success with it, like Mitch said, out on those pastures, keeping those cattle off of those heavily grazed areas. I was impressed with it that first summer out. It definitely was a lot of trial and error and stuff like that, but
So you mentioned real quick about the towers. So how is it, kind of talking through the technology a little bit, maybe building on Nathan's question. So these places have towers, and that's kind of how it's communicating. And are there other systems out there that just you communicate with a satellite? And how does that, play into kind of decision making from a producer standpoint of what different technologies they potentially could implement?
Yeah, the technology, like all technology is evolving, and there's a lot of different ways. And so this particular company, that's what they used in terms of, that's how you needed to have the tower, a base station, and then that's what spoke to the collar. So if it was relatively flat, or you could get it up on a really high location that had a long reach, I mean, they could go a long ways and interact with that collar. And that's essentially, yeah, you'd build the virtual fence on the software. You would hit basically send, and what that would do is that would communicate with that tower through a cell network, and then that tower would then give that information to the virtual fence collar. And so once that's downloaded on, it knows where that line is. And as Kaitlyn said, so as the animal approaches it, gives them an audio cue. If they continue, it gives them an electric cue to keep them either within or out of an area. And so there's a couple other technologies that are tied in this too, is if you have areas that are in good cell reception. So we just got some from another company that they're all cell based. And so if, as long as we have good cell, and it doesn't take a lot usually, as long as we have good cell reception, those collars can function anywhere in that space, and who knows, in the future there might be even more technology that's linked to some satellite, those types of things that as the cost comes down, that could be also used in that space as well. And so, yeah, as Kaitlyn kind of said, that I think training becomes really important, and so especially from like a wildlife management standpoint, I mean, there may be opportunities where you're thinking, I want to not graze this area because I want to save this area for more vegetation out in this area for certain objectives, or the opposite of that is I want to graze more in this area for other objectives, and you want to create some of that spatial heterogeneity that it could be out there. And so, both fencing out and fencing in, we found to be pretty effective. There's one of the places we had them had a little stream running through it. And so we did some work, we want to keep them out of that riparian area, right? Because they can get down and cause some problems in that. And so we ran ran the virtual fence along this riparian area, and I think we just had one go into the electric zone for just really briefly and came back out, and cattle really respected that boundary. So you can think about, I mean, that really creates almost unlimited opportunities for either keeping cattle in or keeping cattle out at multiple spatial scales. I mean, it can be very small. I mean, we were only off of that, maybe like, I don't know, 50 meters off of that stream or something like that, maybe a little bit more. But I mean that it would be impossible to do that with even electric fence would just be a really big challenge, as that stream meanders around to do that. And so yeah, I mean, I think there are quite a few, I think, really neat applications that could be applied with it. And so yeah, going back to the technology, yeah. So there are a lot of different, well, depending on the company you go with, there are different avenues that it just needs to have some sort of connectivity to it.
Sure. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah.
You mentioned training cattle a little bit. You touched on that. What does that process look like? Because I imagine you just can't throw them on your critters and kick them out because they probably won't know what the heck's going on. So.
Yeah, it's not recommended. It's not recommended just throw them on and throw them out there. I mean, we kind of did that for the research side of things, but in a normal situation, you want to give those cattle the ability to adapt. I always say cattle are a lot smarter than what people give them credit for. And that training time period, it's really critical for those cattle. So that way they're not experiencing like an overwhelming amount of stress and like not being able to learn the system. So a training method that a lot of people have been going towards, and one that we used when we trained our cattle out on pasture, is it's still recommended that you have a perimeter fence around your cattle. The virtual fencing technology is a lot more recommended for a rotational grazing type system.
Sure.
Or as Mitch said, keeping them in or out of certain areas, because like all technology, you might have that cow that doesn't respect it, or you might have issues that one day. And so I wouldn't go putting it on, like a cover crop field next to a busy highway and expect your cows to stay in. So what we do is we take that perimeter fence and we set up the virtual fence boundary, basically following the same shape and along it. And we make that electrical cue zone and that audio cue zone. So that way when those cattle interact with the virtual fence for the first time, they're seeing the physical fence.
Okay.
So that way they might be able to, in their brains, be like, okay, it's a barrier, right? And so they learn that electrical cue, they learn that audio cue. So that way then when you're out in open range, they hear that audio cue. If they have to, they feel that electrical cue, and then they're like, okay, barrier. And it just kind of goes off in their brain. And what we said, yeah, like I said earlier, I think 3 days is about the average of what people are expecting it takes the cows to learn the technology. And it's been working really well.
It's awesome.
How big of a pen do you start them out in, or pasture?
I think it just depends on the situation. I mean, we did a lot of our research. It was just one of the calving lots behind the barn. But I want to say it was just a sub-irrigated meadow pasture. I can't think of the exact size of it off the top of my head, but it wasn't a very large pasture. Give them time to really learn those boundaries and stuff like that. I would probably suggest starting them off in a smaller area. It might be easier for them to learn. They might interact with it a little bit more so they can get used to the system.
Well, I kind of think of that like it's, an analogy. It's simply like you were talking about earlier. It's like having the virtual fencing for your pets.
Mm-hmm.
And so similarly, that like I see some of them, they'll put out flags there just to kind of give a visible barrier for a period of time. And then you pull that out and then they've learned those boundaries. And it's kind of the same idea from what you're saying.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting applications, Mitch, as you mentioned about. And I think one of the things, and as we kind of, talk a little more about your project, you mentioned about with the wildlife benefits there. So I guess maybe to kind of, before we jump into that, like how, we talked about a little bit about the technology. We mentioned a little bit about you starting this project and for your master's degree, and now you're wrapped up. You officially graduated, a week ago or so, which is awesome. Congratulations on that, completing your master's degree. So I guess kind of talk about like the specifics of the project and maybe, how the project came to be and, what are some of the interesting aspects that, kind of came out of that work.
The big point of our project is obviously with all new technology, there's a lot of questions, right?
Sure.
And one of the big ones that came up with this, when you think of those audio cues and electrical shocks on cattle, animal welfare becomes a really big concern really fast because no rancher's ever going to put anything on their cattle that might increase that stress. It could affect grazing, daily gain, just the overall life of that cattle, and no one wants that. When Mitch started looking at all the research that had been out there. There was some studies that had to do with cattle stress and virtual fencing, but a lot of it was the chronic stress side of things.
Oh, okay.
So when you talk about stress research in cattle, there's acute stress, which is stress that happens in like usually seconds to minutes after a stressful event happens. That's the stress that the cow experiences.
Yeah.
And then chronic stress is stress that anywhere that lasts from like hours to weeks, hopefully not months, but it falls in that category side of things.
Sure.
And so what a lot of researchers were doing is they were doing like hair and fecal cortisol samples and looking at that chronic stress, how that sound and shock cues affected those cows. And they weren't finding anything. They were finding that the technology wasn't adding any additional stress to those cows. But Mitch and I wanted to be ambitious and look at it on the acute stress side of things, which not a lot of researchers had done up until that point because it's hard to measure. Cattle heart rate. We decided to use the cattle heart rate because that's the typical response you use to measure acute stress in cattle.
Yeah.
And a lot of people can't put heart rate monitors on cows and let them wander around an open pasture
And
and hope
cow
these things
Fitbits
stay
out
on.
there.
We really wanted to work on that side of things. So what we basically did is it was with the Polar Company. So again, similar to what you'd strap on a racehorse is basically the technology we used. And we wrapped it around the girth of the cow. And I have a picture I can show you.
Oh, sure.
So that way
we
it
can
makes,
share some of that stuff
Yeah.
out. Yeah.
So that way it's easier to kind of visualize. But we basically had a smartwatch zip tied to the top of it. And we had these heart sensors that would get wrapped around the cow and they would record a constant heart rate every second. And that information would be sent Bluetooth to the sport watch on top of the cow. And we were able to upload all that data and run a bunch of analysis. And we were able to compare those heart rates. We did a period without virtual fence, a control period, just to get establish a baseline heart rate.
Yeah.
And then that way we were able to compare things. And then we sent the animals out in groups and they all had the virtual fence collars on. And half of them had our heart rate monitors on. And we did physical observations of how those cows reacted when they hit that virtual fence sound and shock stimulus. And then we did those physical observations. Then we had their heart rate observations.
So you had somebody actually there watching the behavior of them and kind of marking down. Okay.
Mitch and I were standing there with a clipboard and we'd listen and we'd watch one go off and we'd mark down, what they did and how they reacted. And it was a really cool process. We did our first trial in June, and that was the first time a lot of the cows had ever experienced that virtual fence before. And then we let them out for the 60-day summer grazing period. So they had that whole summer to get trained and accustomed to virtual fence out on the pasture. And then we ran the same trial again in August. And it was amazing to see what those cows had learned over those 60 days.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they are really smart.
They're really smart.
Yeah, they learn pretty fast. I think that was interesting. You mentioned 3 days. Yeah, it didn't take them very long to figure that out, which makes sense. They probably learn that pretty quick. And they're obviously a herd species, so they're kind of realizing we probably should all stay over this way and kind of stay away from something. But of course, you're going to have some, as you noted earlier, that say, I don't really care what this technology is. I'm going to kind of buck the trend per se and go across. So, and I think that's part of that conversation you mentioned earlier. Is you still have an outside perimeter fence. So it's not like you're eliminating all fences in the landscape. And so but it's helping, especially that cross fencing, trying to mitigate the amount of time and effort you have to put into that and expense, obviously, in doing that.
Yep, definitely. And we used all mature cows for our study, and they had a calf by their side throughout the whole thing.
Sure.
And that's something a lot of people ask is what about the calves? And I can say firsthand experience when I was out there in the pasture, I knew where my virtual fence line just kind of from where I set it in the pasture. I could visualize where it was. And I had all my cows over here where they were supposed to be grazing, kind of doing their thing. And all their calves were on the opposite side of that virtual fence line, not far away enough to be concerned or anything. But, they had fun because they knew they didn't matter where they went. There was no problem to that whatsoever. But it didn't seem to mess with the cows at all. They were still doing their thing where they were supposed to be. And so that was also exciting to see from that side of things.
That's actually an interesting question. Is there any information on can you put out virtual fencing on calves, or is it primarily you're just putting them on your mature adults at this point? I'm just curious, are people implementing that on calves?
So not as much on calves. When we're thinking getting into the yearlings, then that's had more research with yearling cattle, but not as much on younger calves. And so. Okay, just follow up on that is the big thing that we found with the heart rates is that typically, if an animal did receive a shock, there was a typical response in that heart rate, elevated heart rate at the time of the shock. But what we found is that it was relatively short. Most of the time, within about 30 to 60 seconds, that heart rate had gone back down to that normalized level that we measured. And it was only the longest one we saw was about 4 minutes, and that was an animal that stayed within that electric cueing zone and got at least 2 electric cues that we know of. And so you saw it go up and then up again as it got the second cue. And but in this study, over that 30-minute period, we ended up concluding that mean heart rates were not different between the control period and the period where they were experienced the virtual fencing when that was on. And so, in essence, it's that they were able to adapt within just these 30-minute periods is really what we generally concluded, is that they started to pick up on what those audio and electric cues meant. And so by the end of the virtual fence period, we really saw a lot of times they were standing, near where the boundary was. They really start to associate, like, oh, okay, if I go over there, this is going to happen. And so, I'm going to stay over here. Now, we did see, more movement, especially the first time those animals experienced that. I mean, there's a lot of head shaking, there's a lot of, jumping and some running, but, after they'd been trained to it and been out using it all summer long, the number of electric cues dropped by over half. So they were responding more and more to that audio cue, and as well as their reactions, right, Kaitlyn? Most of the time, it was like, oh, there's the sound, okay, turn around, or just I'm going to stop here. It wasn't a lot of running, or that went down to almost zero. It was, even when they received an electric cue or moved past the sound boundary, it was oftentimes just a small reaction to that electric cue and then going back into that. And so one of the things we were worried about was like, well, if we put this boundary up there, they're going to forever associate this particular area with a bad experience, right? And never go there again. And, by and large, we found that they really start to understand, we think, you don't know this for certain, but it appears that they start to understand that like, oh, okay, what's going on now is this thing strapped around my neck and it's telling me where I can and can't go. Because we would pull the fences when we want them to graze somewhere else. And it was typically not very long before they would move past where that boundary was at, no problem. And so, which was kind of neat. I kind of thought, well, they're gonna not go past some of these areas because they're gonna be like, man, I'm gonna get shocked if I go into this place again. But that was, I think, one of the neater things that we observed as we did this project, was just that learning ability when especially those clear signals, once they can associate that this is what this means, that's what they do. And so and we found relatively high success, I think, in terms of when the collars were working, when everything was working, or when they were on and working, and cattle were out in the pasture. Typically 85-90% of our cattle stayed within those boundaries. There were a few that went past them, and as Kaitlyn mentioned, the collars are designed to shut off if they go past or go have multiple shock or electric cueing events. And so you would have to go into the program and turn those back on, but they can come back into water and everything, so it doesn't keep them out. They're directional. If they go this way, they'll get the electric cue. If they come back this way, even if they're still on, they won't receive that electric cue. And but for the most part, that was only a handful of the number we had them on. And so it was encouraging to see that just how well cattle can be trained and understand that.
So how did you draw them across the line when you moved your fence and you shut it off and you were going to a new area within that pasture? Did you have to use cake, grain them, or?
Nothing. At that point in time, like what Mitch was saying about how they didn't seem to be scared of a new area at all, I think a really great example of it was actually the gate. in the research pen that we used. It was the gate they had to come into when they came out from pasture. And they know that gate because they're research cows. They get ran through that gate to do a lot of different things. And so when we set the virtual fence up in our testing pen, we cut off that gate so they couldn't get over in that corner. And, almost every cow tried. She tried to get to that gate because she knew that was her way out back to pasture. And eventually they learned they couldn't go over there, right? Well, when everything was said and done, turned off the virtual fence, opened that gate. And I think they approached it with caution, but once they didn't hear that sound, they were gone. Like, it didn't take anything for them to be like, nope, okay, we know where we're going now. And I mean, even out on pastures, I think of a lot of the research papers I read. I mean, it depends on the cow and how they're grazing and stuff like that. But some of them saw it as quick as 10 minutes. Those cows would just start meandering to those different parts of the pasture. And it really was just like they were listening for that audio cue. And that's really what stopped them from going in different areas. And I've seen it where people turn them off and, they go physically out and move them. You could use cake, four-wheelers, horses, whatever you want. I've seen that happen, but I've also, just seen it where they turn it off, turn on a new one, and let them kind of meander around themselves until they figure it out.
Yeah, that would be ideal instead of having to force them or bring food out there to get them across the line. Did you look at anything else outside of stress on cattle? Did you look at daily gains or anything like that?
Not for this side of the project. We mainly looked at how well the virtual fence worked and the stress side of things and then their physical reactions. And that was fun because Mitch was out there with me and we got to watch how they reacted. And there was a couple other technicians out there. And in August, they looked at me and this is a lot more boring to watch this time because they're not really doing anything. And I was like, no, that's good. This is what we want to see, And they're like, oh, okay, I guess. And I'm like, no, this is good. This is what I wanted. But yeah, those were probably the big main aspects on the beef cattle side of things.
Sure.
And with all master's projects, of course, we had a bunch of other ideas, but 2 years, you gotta draw the line somewhere.
But that means Mitch has to keep writing more grants and getting more money to continue expanding on that technology. And I guess that's to the point. It's relatively, a lot of this stuff is new, as you were alluding to, Mitch. And so there's a lot of questions that are there that producers are asking.
Mm-hmm.
You guys just had the, what was it? How many years was the Goodmanson Ranch? Is that
the 25th,
yeah,
25th
anniversary here just the other day.
Of the open house,
yeah, which is awesome. You guys had that last week. And so I'm sure you get questions from people as you share that information out. Well, what about this? What about that? And so, again, a lot of that can go into development of future research questions and projects and such. So, yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and there's been several other projects at other locations, other countries as well that has explored the weight gains question, and by and large, most of them are not seeing any different than animals managed with electric fence or typical other conventional fencing out there.
Yeah, that's neat because, as we know, cattle know exactly what they want to eat. They're pretty picky, right? So if you're kind of keeping them out of a certain area and they're still holding those gains, that's really neat to see.
That's cool.
Yeah, and these studies tried to look at it more along the lines of equal. So similar types of grazing systems in either using electric fence or virtual fence. So it was essentially the fencing method was the test there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
As you get into, and that you bring up a good point there, though, Nathan, is that as you do some of these things, that's also some of the questions we got to be asking, right? Because we can manage them in a different way that could cause some either by limiting their access to certain forages, or maybe less nutritious type forages too, or higher stock densities. We could be actually causing some reduced performance in some animals or production values in those animals. And so it does bring on that kind of like what we mentioned before, that you have to kind of understand your system, understand your cattle, understand what if we manage this way with virtual fence or electric fence, that might cause X, Y, and Z to happen, right? Whether that be in the range aspect or the cattle aspect. And so, yeah, it really goes down to that, making sure you're out with your cattle, visualizing and making sure that they're not losing condition, those types of things. And so, and part of it too, though, is you can see some of this on the screen as well, because they're getting GPS points every 10 to 30 minutes. And so you can see it as well, how often they're interacting with that fence. And so brings up some of those questions of if they're interacting with those fences a lot, maybe maybe I need to open up more area to them or give them more forage out there than what they have. And so really an adaptive learning process, I think, is necessary for this new technology.
That's really cool. Yeah. And I think that, keep hitting on the point of that connection to the land. I think that's, and kind of knowing your operation. I think that's such an important aspect. And we in our lab, in the Awesome Lab, we talk a lot about that and engaging with landowners. And to your point, Mitch, earlier, there is no cookie cutter approach. Every ranch is going to be different. Every property is going to be different ultimately. So there's going to be certain things that you need to be able to manage for specifically, and you need to know those aspects. And so you can't just necessarily use what the neighbor uses because maybe your system's a little different. But again, that comes back to that connection and knowing your property and what your objectives are. So yeah, that's great. And so I guess, kind of maybe making a little transition, and I will note that we can link up the paper I think you got published here not too long ago on that work with the stress and stuff.
Congratulations.
And so
Thank
it was
you.
awesome to get that out. But I wanted to kind of transition a little bit and think about the other aspect of your project, and that was the wildlife side of things. Again, we talked a little bit about what the kind of management and the scale really of the work that you did was pretty small in the sense of how many acres we were able to utilize the technology on. But thinking about the Goodmanson Ranch as an example, that's about a 12,000 acre ranch in the Sandhills. So can you talk a little bit about, what, the future looks like potentially for, utilizing this technology and maybe how that ties specifically into what you actually did and kind of describing that to people out there using cameras?
Yeah, like you said, the Goodmanson Ranch is around 12,000 acres out in the middle of the Sandhills. And when we got started with our master's project, I got super interested in not only the virtual fence side of things and how it could affect cattle, but my undergrad was in fisheries and wildlife. So instantly the light bulb went off in my brain and I was like, how could we use this to also conserve like wildlife habitat?
Yeah.
Because I was like, this could be such a new and cool thing because ranchers don't have to go up and put up a bunch of electric fence to keep cattle out of, a prairie chicken lek area or something like that. And when we really started throwing around ideas of how we could implement some sort of a wildlife component into the virtual fencing project, the big question kind of hit the beginning was almost like with all wildlife projects. Well, we can't manage for wildlife if we don't know what wildlife is there and what areas they utilize, especially in a big ranch in the middle of the Sandhills.
Sure.
Obviously, being out there for 2 summers, I saw so many different wildlife and it was so interesting. But there at that point had never been a study really done at Goodmanson documenting all of the different wildlife on the ranch. And so we put our heads together and we created this game camera project where we put 30 game cameras out over the Goodmanson Ranch. And we wanted to focus on the 3 main topographical areas that appear out at the ranch. So that's our sub-irrigated meadows. So that's a lot of those upland sandhills meadows that usually have some sort of standing water or just have a water table that's really high. And then you have the dune tops, which is the tops of your sand dunes.
Oh, sure.
And then you have the dry valleys, just obviously where there's no like standing water. That water table's a little lower beneath the surface. And we wanted to see if these different topographical areas affected wildlife presence and abundance. We just wanted to see what was out there because then the idea came into our head, okay, if we know what's out there and if we find out that we have a bunch of pronghorn and they're specifically focused on maybe this one corner of the ranch, would it be possible to go in and take out a bunch of interior fences and potentially implement virtual fence someday to eliminate physical fence and pronghorn conflict and stuff like that? And we were able to put these 30 game cameras out. We put them out in the summer of 2023, and we were able to find a variety of wildlife species out on the ranch, from white-tailed deer and mule deer, porcupines. We had a couple raccoons, which was honestly really surprising. Never thought I'd see that out there. Those were probably a lot of our big species, tons of upland birds, tons of songbirds. What we ended up finding was a lot of these animals selected sub-irrigated meadows over both of the other topographical areas, which looking at it, we really weren't that surprised due to the fact sub-irrigated meadows, if you're out on that hot, dry landscape in the middle of the summer, which we were, that's usually a constant source of water. A lot of the vegetation in that area is a lot higher. It's like more nutrient dense. A lot of songbirds use it for the nesting season. A lot of deer use it for fawning, stuff like that. And so it was just really exciting for us to see kind of this big area utilized by wildlife. And then we didn't get to actually put any virtual fence on the landscape to do any wildlife type of conservation work. But that's, I think what we did was like the foundational first step.
Yeah.
Identifying what's there, where they're at, And
Yeah.
that's what I think the really big kind of takeaway from the project was. And we're currently in our second year of data collection
Yeah.
for that project. So we're really hoping that that can kind of set the foundation for future wildlife research out at the ranch. And then hopefully someday using virtual fence to manage for some of the wildlife out there.
Yeah, that's neat that you were actually able to take that first step, because a lot of people don't really realize you need kind of that pilot data, or you need something to build off of, which is how all research works. So that's really neat that you took that first step.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll add into that. I think, and you mentioned about getting that pilot data, the value of having that. And I think about like even with our pronghorn project that we just wrapped up here recently in collaboration with Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. One of the questions that we wanted to know is like, well, where are these pronghorn moving on the landscape? And you mentioned about fences. So pronghorn are a species. They typically don't jump over fences. They'll go underneath. And the reason particularly is their bone structure. They're very lightweight bone structure. So they can run really fast, being that fastest land mammal here in North America. And so with that, being able to find ways or kind of these points of crossing, then that's where managers could target and say, okay, well, we need to adjust fencing in these areas. So that's a good example of if you have some of that pilot study data like we now have with our GPS collars for a pronghorn, we can kind of say, here are some really key areas over the course, in our case, of 2 years of data where we know these pronghorn are regularly moving. And these are areas you potentially could target for management. So specifically where your camera data could show. So, yeah.
Yeah, it was really, really exciting. It was kind of a fun challenge at the ranch because, you're in the middle of the sandhills. It's not just like you have a tree that you can go stick a game camera on. And so, I mean, some of them got stuck on like fence posts and things like that. And going back to my cattle are so smart, they annoyed me to the point where like we had to build cattle exclusion cages around all these game cameras, and then they acted as scratching posts. So, then that was its own set of challenges. But I could stick that camera on a fence post, and there could be 1,000 fence posts in that line, and I would have a picture of a cow on that game camera licking it or sniffing it within an hour of me putting that thing up. And just stuff like that. Like it was a really fun challenge. It was really exciting to get to see a bunch of the wildlife out there. I think we ended up with a total of around 4,500 images of wildlife that we captured out at the Goodmanson from June to October is when we had those cameras up. And so I'm excited to see what this year looks like.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm excited to potentially use virtual fence and sub-irrigated meadows to create those heterogeneous landscapes, like what Mitch said. Because like you think of like songbirds, there's some songbirds and their preferred habitat is basically like bare ground, but then you hit other ones and they want super tall, dense vegetation to build their nests in. No rancher wants to go out and put up a bunch of electric fence, so this is short, this is tall. Like no one has time to go out and do that. And so maybe something like with virtual fencing, you could integrate that grazing aspect, get cattle on that landscape, and create those areas more naturally. Yeah. And so those were like the really exciting parts of it, I think, especially on the wildlife side of it.
That's super cool.
Yeah, I think the wildlife community and kind of like you mentioned, the birding community could get really excited and really behind this sort of technology. And that kind of loops me back. Were there any other partners for this project or who all collaborated on it?
It was Mitch and all of his team out in Scottsbluff, and then Andy and the Awesome Lab team here at UNL. And then our other big person was obviously the grant was funded through like the USDA Agricultural Research Service, and that was the Precision Livestock Management for Western Rangelands grant. Those were the really big key players in this whole project.
That's cool. Yeah. No, I think there's so many applications with the technology, and that's what excites me a lot because, of course, in our lab, that's part of our mission is we're basically focused on finding that balance for producers so that they can obviously be profitable. Feeding and fueling the world while ensuring the sustainability for future generations. And so how can we utilize technology like this? And it just keeps coming back in my mind, that connection back to the land and finding ways that you can kind of, utilize these new technologies are out there to really optimize the way you operate your operation currently. And I think it's, to me, I think the future is bright. I think there's a lot of cool opportunities that are going to come into fruition in the coming years of this technology as it continues to advance on, and people become more aware of it. And addressing, with work that Mitch and others are doing, just continue to advance that the questions and addressing those questions that people keep coming up with, just to continue to keep increasing adoption of that technology. So, yeah, that's great.
The future of the virtual fencing is kind of just bringing the cost down, right, for producers to get on board, or kind of what's that last barrier?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And I think as most things in technology, we see those prices start to come down. as more people adopt, we find more cost effective ways of doing things. But I think it is valuable for anybody interested in this to really sit down. Sometimes the objectives might be, the cost may be definitely worth it. If you are managing for some wildlife or other things like that, it's probably pretty hard to nail down, this is my return on investment on these things, but it can make things a little bit easier for us to manage for X, Y, and Z. And so either it needs to be, profitable, or it needs to make life easier, right? And if it does both of those, all the better, right? If it does neither of those, then you might want to sit down and be like, well, is this our best tool, right?
Yeah.
In that context. But yeah, I mean, I think it's even just in the last few years. I mean, it's been with multiple companies all of a sudden coming on board with this that have different strengths and differences in how they their systems are set up, and it really does kind of make it pretty exciting to kind of see that and see that okay, there's a lot of avenues of folks that are coming at this system, and looking at ways to make it better and better, right? And to make it more useful as that tool. And so yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be more. We'll see more and more opportunities. I think there's a lot of researchers, across the Western United States that are evaluating, different ways that you can graze with virtual fence. There was a few years ago, there was a study out of Eastern Oregon looking at, can we use virtual fence to create fire breaks? Basically they were putting these fire breaks out on the landscape, keeping cattle in a certain area for a given amount of time to drop the amount of fine fuels that were there. Other folks have looked at it, as I mentioned before, as in riparian area management in some of these huge allotments where grazing occurs in the Western United States. One of the challenges is cattle congregate down on these riparian areas, and sometimes they graze them too heavily, and that has some negative consequences. And so ranchers in some of those areas are out riding. They're moving cattle off those riparian areas. They're putting other attractants off those riparian areas to pull cattle out. But with virtual fence technology, then that's just a matter of putting those boundaries out there. And in that situation, a few cattle, if they get past it, or if the collars stop working or other things, that's not probably a big issue to have a few cattle get past it. But you're able to utilize the whole landscape, keep grazing out on that landscape, but also manage these kind of like high value areas for wildlife where we don't want quite as much or grazing on those in particular areas in that aspect. And so, I think it creates a really good opportunity for creativity too in this space, because before it would take time. If you put in a four strand barbed wire fence, say that's there, right? You're not taking that out for decades.
Yeah.
Or you hope you don't have to, right? Because they're expensive and it takes a lot of work to get them in. And in some areas they're just not practical, right? And it's especially some of these big areas out west. It's just really difficult to get fence in those areas. Other areas where you could put in like I said, a polywire or electric fence, relatively easy. Yeah, you need to weigh that if that's a better option. But even then, if you're putting in miles of that gets challenging too in some of these big pastures. And so, but yeah, creativity it could really move past that to where, I got this old fence here, I've been wanting to take it out. It doesn't really serve me much purpose. And and I could take that out and manage my cattle with virtual fence now better. And so yeah, I mean, it really creates a lot of opportunities for people to be creative and think about their management in a way. And then as Kaitlyn pointed out, if you know your wildlife and maybe some of the places where you have leks or you have a nesting area over here, that it's there and you want to enhance that. Well, all of a sudden you have an extra tool to say, man, I need to graze cattle here at certain times, and in my rotation, they have to be in here some years at maybe when it would remove some of that where that I want to keep for nesting. Well, I know that this area over here is where I see a lot of those birds. So I'm going to just go ahead and fence that corner off, let them have let just build up biomass and then come back in the wintertime and graze it, or whenever. You can really start to be flexible in that nature in how you move cattle across the landscape for specific objectives, which I think is pretty cool. And I think that's
Yeah.
really fun to be able to kind of think through some of those challenging questions and be more creative in how we manage for certain things.
That's cool. Yeah, and I like that word creative. I think that's a really important aspect of virtual fence technology. It allows you to have flexibility, as you mentioned, Mitch, and allows you to be creative and kind of maybe challenge the status quo of kind of what you've done on your current operation and say, I've always wanted to do this, but I didn't have the tools. No, now I have some option that I can utilize to be able to address that objective I've always been wanting to address.
Those light bulb moments are so fun to see.
Oh, I'm
Because you
sure.
watch the
Yeah.
rancher's face like light up and they're like, wait, so I could do this?
Yeah,
and
that's
I'm like,
super
yes.
cool.
Like,
Yeah,
you could
that's
do
super
that.
cool.
And so those are
Yeah.
always really fun moments, and watching them get just as excited, as you are about it. And it's so fun because it's so new. So you never
Yeah.
know what question you're going to get. And yeah, there's questions where I've had to look at Mitch and I'm like, do you know the answer to this? Because I don't know it yet.
Yeah.
No one knows the answer to it
Yeah.
yet. And
Well, and
so,
that's cool though, because I think that's actually part of the reason we also started this podcast was not only just to get information out, but also to think about like innovative ideas and how do we kind of, challenge some of the current things we've been doing for a long time and come up with creative ways. And then maybe some of these ideas turn to Mitch and I to go out and do research projects on and stuff like that because of those questions that get generated. And so, yeah, I love it. It's awesome.
Yeah, and I think it's extremely important and exciting to actually boil the research down and get it into a usable form for growers and producers out there on the landscape. So thanks again for coming in. One last question that I have, Mitch, is since you have all of the equipment for the virtual fencing, kind of what's the next step in the research, or is this project going to continue on?
Yeah, so we're gonna keep working with it. So we have another project that's gonna be, we did it last year and we're doing another year of it where we are actually looking at how virtual fence affects how far calves will move away from their mothers. And so in those studies, we have different groups of cows and calves, and we put GPS collars on the calves, and then we manage them without virtual fence, and then we put a virtual fence down the middle and see if those calves still move away from their mothers. And usually we do this a little bit later in the growing season, so it's going to start up another year here in just next week. And so we have that. We're also going to be doing some work out here in the Panhandle. We have a annual invasive grass, cheatgrass, downy brome, that's pretty prevalent in some areas. And so we've started using it, looking at ways to keep them either on those patches where there's more annual grasses, or maybe more so to keep them out of some of our core areas of perennial grasses that cheatgrass hasn't invaded into. And
Sure.
so we've been using that technology, and we hope to do more research in that space with virtual fence. And then just better understanding it. There's a few folks here in Nebraska that are using it, and we're talking with them, working with them a little bit to better understand some of their challenges that they're up against, and kind of like I mentioned and Kaitlyn mentioned as well, there are still some challenges. It's not
Sure.
100%, and the collars can fall off. There was some issues when we started with some of the tags we were using to attach the collars around the neck. They were breaking halfway through the year, and a lot of collars are falling off. So the companies are having to make some of these adaptations as they learn more too, and better ways to keep them on. But so yeah, I mean, we hope to continue learning and sharing that what we know with folks that are interested in jumping in on it.
That's super cool. And I guess I'll ask one quick question. I should have asked this earlier, but just to kind of give people a sense of this, you mentioned about bringing down the cost. Like on average, what does it cost for these collars for somebody? And I'm sure there are different ways you can probably purchase a collar. You could probably rent a collar, just to give people kind of a sense of what, cost that could be.
Yeah, so it can be variable, and it really depends. Like if you're purchasing the collar, the life of the collar, how long you plan on depreciating that out. The some of the ones that you lease, they're $40 to $50 for that lease, and then you oftentimes you have to purchase the battery for $10. So you're looking at 50-ish around dollars. Some of the ones where you purchase the collar and you pay a subscription fee, it might be $1 to $2 a month for that subscription fee. but then you have an upfront cost of $200 to $300 in purchasing that collar. So depreciating that out over years, if it's, let's say $250, you appreciate out 5 years, that's still $50 a year for that collar, plus the added subscription when you have it on. And so yeah, that's just kind of the general range of where they're at there.
That's good. Yeah, no,
that's a good question.
And I think that's just kind of one of those things that you said, technology will just continue to improve and then prices come down. It's like anything else, in life that we experience, there's always things like that, the prices will come down. Think about your phones and other things like that over time. So
I will say, just to add to that cost of it, the towers themselves that you have to run, the collars we used for our side, we used the ones that used that, I'm going to say it wrong now, like LoRaWAN, thank you, that signal. And to be able to purchase those towers on a place like Goodmanson, you would need on average probably 3 to 4 towers to cover the whole ranch, depending on where you put them. And those towers run on average between $10,000 to $12,000 for the system setup and per tower.
Sure.
And some producers are going and putting those towers on like trailers, so that way they don't have to have as many on their property, and it's more of a portable thing. But that does void your warranty, so
it's important to know.
Yeah, that is important to know.
But that kind of gives people a sense of kind of what the cost is, because I'm sure there are some people and saying, well, they start weighing those cost benefits out, and they're saying, well, I'll just put up cross fencing. That's probably cheaper. But the flip side of it is, and this goes back to the earlier point, every operation is different. And you mentioned especially some of these western states that are managing your thousands of acres, and it's honestly probably ends up being cheaper in the long run using that technology and having to spend all the labor and resources to put some of that out. And I think that's some of the things will be interesting in the future, is doing some of those kind of cost benefit analyses, which I'm sure there are already some things out there, but I'm sure growing in the future that stuff to help people make that decision. But again, it all comes back to the simple question is, like how big is your operation and what are your objectives and kind of what you're wanting to do there. And it's not saying that everybody should necessarily implement all these technologies, but ultimately there's certain places where it's going to fit really well, and maybe certain places maybe it doesn't fit as well. But again, it's a tool, and that's always go back to this idea of a toolbox. You have a hammer in your toolbox. Well, a hammer is not going to be useful when you're trying to screw out a screw. So you're finding ways to utilize those different tools in a different way. So.
And off the top of my head, I don't have any other questions.
No, this has been great. I really appreciate you guys joining us today. And thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks again for coming in, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It was fun.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Yep, we'll see you.
Wild Ag is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave us a review so others can find us and tune in.
And we want to hear from you. You can submit questions or topic suggestions to us at wildagpodcast@gmail.com. That's WILDAG podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.